Hello, family. Here's part 2 of the story. Check our page for part 1. Here's the summary for part 1. Ruth Daniels, once the devoted wife of Danny, is heartbroken after years of failed fertility treatments and growing emotional neglect. Mocked by Kimberly, Danny's ambitious mistress, Ruth is eventually discarded and replaced. After a humiliating divorce, she quietly rebuilds her life in a new town. Through IVF, she conceives twins Daniel and Daniela without informing Danny. Meanwhile, Kimberly flaunts her position, giving birth to a son she claims is Danny's. But as years pass, cracks appear. Danny grows distant, and doubts begin to rise about the child's paternity. Ruth, now thriving and emotionally restored, is invited to speak publicly, and a photo of her with her twins goes viral. Their uncanny resemblance to Danny sparks public and private curiosity. Danny, confronted by truth and regret, demands a DNA test, only to discover Kimberly's son isn't his. At a final meeting, he asks Ruth if the twins are his. Her calm response, "You're asking the wrong question," seals his fate. Ruth walks away with dignity, never seeking revenge, only peace. Her story closes not with bitterness, but with grace, having built a new life anchored in self-worth, truth, and the double blessing that healed her deepest wound. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. Danny stood outside the high black gate, the same gate he never thought he'd knock again. It felt heavier now, not physically, but in memory. With a bouquet in one hand and a quiet guilt in the other, he pressed the bell. A female voice answered through the intercom. "Who is it?" He hesitated. "It's me, Ruth." "It's Danny." Silence. Then this house doesn't take back what it didn't fight to keep. The gate remained closed. He lingered, hoping she would at least peek from the window. But no curtain moved. Betty arrived minutes later with groceries and froze when she saw him. "You have audacity," she muttered. You threw her into darkness. "Now that the lights are back on, you want to come in?" Danny looked down, voice cracking. "I just want to see the kids." Betty looked him over. "They're not broken toys waiting for your guilt." She brushed past him and entered. The door clicked shut behind her. Danny remained outside until the sun sank. That night, Ruth sat in her living room, the twins asleep in their room, while Betty sipped tea beside her. "He came," Betty said gently. Ruth didn't react. Her eyes were steady, her face unreadable. "You knew he would," Betty added. "Men like Danny always try to return when silence gets too loud." Ruth finally spoke, her voice almost a whisper. "It's not that I hate him. It's that I can't trust myself if I let him speak." Betty reached for her hand. "You don't owe him a moment of your healing." Ruth blinked slowly, the weight of years tightening in her chest. "The same mouth that told me I was empty now wants to call me home." There were no tears, just that hollow ache of betrayal that refused to die, even when peace had come. Outside, Danny sat in his car for hours, watching the light in the twins' room flicker off. He didn't drive away immediately, because for the first time, he knew he would have to knock more than once. 2 days later, a sleek courier van pulled into Ruth's compound. The driver stepped out, holding beautifully wrapped boxes with expensive ribbons, designer toys, a mini piano, imported educational kits. He handed them to the nanny, smiling. "From Mr. Daniels," he said proudly, like he was delivering peace. The nanny hesitated, then passed them to Betty, who was already shaking her head. Ruth emerged from the hallway, eyes narrowing. "Send them back," she said firmly. Betty added, "Unopened. Let him learn silence, too." Ruth stared at the boxes like they were ticking bombs. "He wants to buy what he threw away," she muttered. Later that evening, Danny received the gifts at his doorstep with a note inside. If it's truly for them, it should start with presence, not performance. The sting of rejection landed harder than he expected. Alone in her kitchen, Ruth wiped down the table as Betty leaned on the fridge door. "You're sure you want to be this hard?" she asked. Ruth paused, cloth in hand. "It's not hardness," she whispered. "It's memory. You don't forget how it felt to be unloved in your weakest hour." Betty walked over and hugged her. "But people change, Ruth." "Yes," Ruth replied softly. "And some people only change because what they chased changed them first." Upstairs, Daniel called for water, and Ruth tucked both twins in again. She kissed their foreheads, lingering on each one. "You are not bargaining chips," she whispered to them. Meanwhile, Danny sat in his apartment, the untouched gifts mocking him. He wasn't angry. He understood now. Love, when discarded, doesn't sit by the door waiting to be retrieved. It builds its own house, and Ruth had built hers with scars he gave her. The school hosted a Dress as Your Future Self Day. Danny found out through the school's online bulletin and decided, against all advice, to go. He didn't want to interrupt, just to watch. He stood at the back of the schoolyard, blending into the crowd. Daniel stepped onto the tiny stage in a little doctor's coat. "I want to fix hearts," he said proudly into the mic. Danny's breath caught in his throat. The resemblance was undeniable, same stance, same gap between the front teeth. Daniela clapped beside her brother in a mini judge's robe. "We are twins," she squealed. Several parents laughed, but Danny stood frozen. Then Daniel, scanning the crowd, locked eyes with him. "That man looks like me," he said loudly, pointing. Teachers glanced awkwardly. Ruth turned from the bench she sat on and saw Danny. She didn't panic. She stood slowly, walked to her twins, and gently ushered them away from the mic. Danny didn't move. The children didn't understand the tension in the air, but Ruth felt it like a cord snapping in her chest. As she passed Danny, he said, "I didn't mean to make a scene." Ruth looked straight ahead. "Scenes require invitations. You weren't invited." The twins waved at him innocently. Daniela asked, "Mummy, who is that man?" Ruth knelt to her level. "Someone we used to know." Danny overheard it. It hurt, but he accepted it. That evening, he stood in his hallway, holding a drawing from Daniel that he'd quietly picked from the trash. It was a crude sketch of a family, 2 kids, a woman, and a man with his face. He smiled bitterly. "Maybe one day," he whispered. "Maybe I'll earn my way into your drawings first." Kimberly was not the type to retreat quietly. After seeing photos of Danny standing at the school event, watching Ruth and the twins, her stomach churned with rage. "So he thinks he can just slide back into her perfect little life," she hissed. She reached out to 2 of Ruth's business partners, men she had briefly charmed during corporate events, and spun a tale about Ruth's company laundering donor money and forging government contracts. The accusations were baseless, but enough to stir panic. An anonymous email containing evidence began circulating. Rumors swirled. The press caught wind. Ruth, blindsided, spent a tense afternoon in meetings with her legal team. Betty stood beside her, furious. "This has Kimberly's fingerprints all over it," she spat. Ruth remained eerily calm. "Let her play with matches," she said softly. "She's forgotten I'm no longer made of paper." Meanwhile, Robert had been tracking Kimberly's online movement quietly, ever since she tried to sabotage Ruth on social media. The moment the rumor broke, he pieced together a breadcrumb trail of dummy accounts, false document timestamps, and one careless email Kimberly had sent using a previous office alias. "Gotcha," he muttered, handing the dossier to Ruth's lawyer. Days later, a legal notice was sent to Kimberly, and every media outlet received a public retraction from Ruth's firm, including irrefutable evidence of the forgery attempt. Kimberly's second strike missed its target. But this time, Danny didn't ignore it. He drove to her apartment, knocked once, and entered without waiting. "You tried to ruin her again?" he said coldly. Kimberly's smugness cracked. "I was just trying to protect us," she offered. Danny looked around the apartment and scoffed. "There is no us." For the first time, her eyes trembled. "You used to love me." He looked her in the eye. "I used to love what I thought you were. That's not the same thing." And he walked out, shutting the door that would never open again. Danny took a long drive to the quiet town Ruth had once vanished into. It was the same place Betty had once mentioned in passing, though never in detail. The roads were lined with tall trees, the breeze oddly nostalgic. He found the small maternity clinic tucked between a pharmacy and a church. Inside, he was greeted by a slender nurse who, upon hearing Ruth's name, stiffened. "We value our patients' privacy," she said politely. Danny nodded, understanding. "I'm not here to dig, I'm here to apologize, even if no one listens." Just as he was about to leave, the doctor, a graying man in his 60s, emerged from his office. His eyes scanned Danny's face. "You're him," he said, not kindly. "The man she cried over, the one she never cursed, even when she had every reason to." Danny swallowed, unsure how to respond. She was grace itself, the doctor added. She gave birth like a warrior and wept like a widow. As they spoke, the clinic door opened, and Ruth stepped in. The three of them froze. She had come to drop off a donation box of baby clothes. The air grew heavy. Danny whispered, "I didn't know you'd be here." Ruth gave the doctor a tired smile, then turned to Danny. "Why are you here, Danny?" He stepped forward, eyes vulnerable. "I needed to see what healing looked like without me. I needed to know how you built it." Ruth's arms folded slowly. "You didn't come to see, you came hoping for cracks." Danny winced. "That's not true. I came to understand the silence I earned." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ruth looked at the doctor. "Please excuse us." He nodded and disappeared inside. Ruth faced Danny. "You can't follow me into peace just because your chaos ran out of fuel." Danny whispered, "I'm not here to force anything. I'm here because I can't move forward if I don't own what I broke." She didn't answer. She simply walked past him, out of the clinic, carrying her quiet strength like a torch he'd never learned to hold. Later that week, Ruth found herself sitting in the front seat of her car outside the twins' school, waiting for dismissal. Danny had texted once since their encounter. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking to serve my sentence." The words echoed. Betty joined her, having just arrived from work. "You look like you're having an internal argument," she teased. Ruth stared ahead. "He says he doesn't want forgiveness. He wants to serve the pain he caused." Betty raised an eyebrow. "That's different." Ruth laughed bitterly. "Or manipulative. I don't know anymore." That evening, she found a small envelope on her doorstep. No name. Just a photo inside of Danny outside the hospital during the twins' birth, blurry and distant. She didn't remember anyone noticing her. On the back of the photo, a handwritten note read, "Even when I didn't know they were mine, something in me knew I was missing something sacred." That night, Ruth sat in her study, staring at the photo under soft lamplight. When the doorbell rang, she already knew who it was. She opened the door halfway. Danny stood there, no flowers, no gifts. "This time," she said, "don't talk." He nodded. She let him in, barely. They sat in the living room, a chasm between them. "I was a coward," Danny said finally. "Not for leaving, but for pretending what I had wasn't enough." Ruth leaned back. "Do you think these grand gestures will erase the nights I wept so silently the walls learned to ignore me too?" Danny's voice trembled. "No, I don't think I deserve anything. I just want to be the man they see in me, even if you never see him again." Ruth stared at him, her heart tight. "Then stop trying to impress me. Start showing them." She stood up. "Because truth doesn't beg, Danny, and neither do I." She left him in the living room with his silence, a silence that, this time, wasn't rejection, but an open door to something harder. Redemption. Danny had not expected Ruth to say yes. When he brought up the idea of a DNA test for the twins, it was more out of duty than doubt, a final chance to silence whispers that he wasn't the father. Ruth looked at him long and hard before answering. "I'm not giving you proof, Danny. I'm giving you permission to rest." She led him to the twins' playroom, where Daniel and Daniela were arranging puzzles. "Kids," she said softly, "this man is your father. He wants to know you a little better. Just a small test. It won't hurt." The twins, curious but trusting, agreed without hesitation. That night, Danny couldn't sleep. The swabs had been sent off, and he sat on the edge of his bed staring at a framed picture of his own father, a man who'd walked away from him too. "If they're mine," he whispered, "I won't fail them. Not the way I failed her." The results came back in a sealed envelope marked confidential paternity verification. Ruth opened it while sitting at her desk, Danny standing by like a student awaiting exam results. Her eyes scanned the paper, her face calm. 99.99%, she said, sliding it across. Danny's breath hitched. The room didn't erupt in emotion. Instead, a stillness blanketed everything. "Thank you," he said, not just to Ruth, but to the God he hadn't prayed to in years. Ruth folded the paper. "Don't let numbers give you rights you haven't earned. Fatherhood isn't in blood, it's in consistency." Danny nodded slowly. "Then let me be consistent." He looked toward the hallway where the twins were napping, the weight of what he almost lost pressing into his bones. As Ruth stood to leave the room, she didn't offer him comfort, but she didn't shut the door behind her either. And that silent invitation, however slight, was enough to spark a kind of hope he dared not name. It started with a headline, "Scandal Deepens. Did Ruth Daniels steal frozen embryos from former husband's clinic visit?" Kimberly had stooped lower than ever, and this time she went national. On a popular daytime talk show, she teared up on live television. "He doesn't know what she's capable of," she said, voice cracking. "Ruth took what wasn't hers, those twins. They were meant to be ours." The audience gasped, and within hours, hashtags flew across social media. Ruth, watching from her office, didn't react immediately. But when Betty stormed in with her phone buzzing and clients calling, Ruth stood slowly. "Enough," she said. "This woman has turned my silence into her spotlight. It's time to cast my own." Danny got the call from Robert. "You need to fix this, now." And for once, Danny didn't hesitate. He scheduled an exclusive interview and sat across from a seasoned journalist, no longer afraid to speak. "The twins are mine. There was no embryo theft. There was no manipulation. Ruth didn't trick me. If anything, I tricked myself into believing a lie because it wore makeup and promised me a legacy without the labor." The clip aired that same evening. In it, he ended with this: "To the mother of my children, I owe you more than truth. I owe you peace." Kimberly watched it all unfold from her apartment, shaking as she realized the tide had finally turned. Her calls went unanswered. Her endorsements pulled back. And the final nail in the coffin? A defamation lawsuit from Ruth's legal team, backed by 2 medical affidavits and the hospital's sworn statement. Ruth never needed to shout. She simply stood, and the world turned its head. The house was quiet when Robert stopped by to visit Danny. The 2 men sat on the back porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over half-empty coffee mugs. Robert studied Danny's profile for a long moment before speaking. "You're closer now than you've ever been," he said. "But don't mistake physical presence for emotional permission." Danny didn't respond immediately. He watched a kite flying above the neighbor's roof. "I know she doesn't trust me yet," he said. "And I don't expect her to." Robert leaned forward. "That's not the point. Ruth might start letting you into her days, but you have to earn your place in her memories again. And that, my friend, takes more than school runs and gift baskets." Danny nodded slowly, the weight of Robert's words settling in. "I want to be there when Daniel loses his first tooth, when Daniela learns to ride a bike. I want to be there constant, not a shadow with good intentions." Robert smiled faintly. "Then walk like someone who's staying. Don't run like someone afraid of rejection." As he stood to leave, he clapped Danny on the back. "You're doing better. Just don't forget, Ruth isn't building a bridge. She's rebuilding a fortress. And if she lets you in, you better be ready to protect it this time." That night, Danny sat by the twins' room, watching them sleep. He didn't knock on Ruth's door. He didn't call out. He simply whispered through the quiet, "I'll stay right here, no matter how long it takes." Daniel was turning 5, and all he could talk about was balloons, chocolate cake, and riding a pony. Ruth had gone all out, renting a small garden space with sunshades and cartoon-themed setups. Betty handled the guest list while Ruth managed the twins' outfits, wanting everything to be perfect. But the night before the celebration, as she tucked Daniel into bed, he clutched his pillow and asked, "Mummy, can Daddy come to my party too?" Ruth's hands froze where they'd been smoothing his sheets. His eyes held no expectations, just innocent curiosity. "We saw him at school last week. He waved at me and smiled." Ruth managed a nod, her voice low. "Let me think about it, okay?" But inside, her heart warred with itself. Was it right to give in now? Would this blur the boundaries she'd fought hard to set? Or had Daniel, in his innocence, asked the question that mattered most? Betty noticed Ruth's silence the next morning and didn't need to ask why. "He's still their father, Ruth. He missed 4 birthdays. If this is how he begins to earn one back, maybe let him try." Ruth didn't answer but sent a brief message to Danny. "You may attend." 1 hour, no surprises, Danny replied instantly. "Thank you. I'll behave." True to his word, he arrived quietly, dressed simply, holding a wrapped gift. When Daniel saw him, his face lit up like dawn. "You came!" he shouted, running straight into his arms. Daniela hung back, clinging to Ruth's leg, unsure. Danny crouched and smiled at her. "Hi, Princess. I brought you something too." She didn't reply but took the gift. It was the smallest moment, one only a mother could fully feel, but Ruth saw it. The bridge being built between past mistakes and a possible future. The party wound down slowly, laughter giving way to music, then yawns. Danny stayed out of the way, helping a staff member refill drinks, tying stray balloons that had floated loose. But when it was time for the cake, Daniel refused to let anyone else stand beside him but his father. Ruth, holding the lighter for the candles, hesitated. "I thought Betty would help," she whispered. Daniel tugged her sleeve. "No, Mummy, I want Daddy too." Reluctantly, Ruth handed Danny the lighter. They stood there together, shoulder to shoulder, as the twins sang loudly and blew out the candles. One moment, just one, but one that bent years of silence into something almost soft. Afterward, as plates were cleared and guests left, Danny stayed back, waiting for Ruth to say it was time for him to go. But instead, she spoke first. "You can help me pack the leftovers." As they boxed the remaining snacks and deflated balloons, the space between them felt less tense. Danny gently reached for a stack of plates, and their hands brushed. Ruth didn't flinch, but she didn't linger either. "They were really happy today," he said, watching Daniel chase Daniela with a balloon sword. Ruth gave a small nod. "They deserve joy. It's been missing for too long." Danny looked at her, then lowered his eyes. "I'm not asking for anything more than a chance to be in their memories. That's all." Ruth didn't respond immediately. She was wiping a table, her movements steady. "Memories aren't built in a day, Danny." He nodded. "I know, but I'll still show up tomorrow." And for the first time, Ruth didn't stop him. The next evening, as dusk painted the sky in tired gold and purple, Danny showed up again, not to see Ruth, but to help bathe the twins, read them stories, and tuck them in. Ruth watched from the hallway, arms folded, as Daniela rested her head on Danny's shoulder. It didn't escape her how natural he looked, how much softer he had become. After the twins had fallen asleep, Ruth walked him to the door. But as she opened it, a sudden gust of wind rushed in, and instinctively, Danny reached out and closed it gently. Their faces were inches apart. Neither moved. Neither spoke. For a heartbeat, the silence throbbed with something unspoken. He leaned in, just slightly, but Ruth took a slow step back. "Don't make me remember what forgetting cost me," she whispered. Danny stepped away immediately, his face flushing with quiet regret. "I'm sorry," he murmured. I miss what we used to be." Ruth shook her head. "We're not what we used to be, Danny. And I'm not that woman anymore. The one who waited. The one who begged." She took a breath. "You say you've changed. That's fine. But don't rush this. Let what's broken decide its pace." Danny nodded slowly, stepping outside into the night. "Then I'll wait," he said, before walking off into the shadows. Ruth closed the door behind him and leaned against it, tears she didn't understand welling in her eyes. Outside, the stars blinked softly, bearing witness to a love that wasn't gone, only fragile, only healing. Kimberly had watched in silence as Ruth's quiet strength re-emerged, and Danny slowly rebuilt what he once tore apart. It festered in her like a wound that wouldn't heal. She no longer lived in the limelight, and whispers in the media had shifted from admiration to mockery. One morning, desperate for control, she approached one of Ruth's former nannies with a devious proposition. "Say Danny tried to touch you," Kimberly said with calm venom. "I'll pay you more than you earn in a year. No one will question it." The young nanny, torn and visibly shaken, asked for time to think, but guilt weighed heavy on her. By dusk, she went straight to Betty's office and confessed everything. "I'm sorry, Ma. She said it would be easy," she sobbed. Betty's face darkened, her fingers tightening around her pen. "You did the right thing, and now we do ours." Betty immediately filed a report, then arranged for a quiet but firm legal move. Kimberly was arrested the next day on charges of attempted defamation, bribery, and interference in a child welfare case. Her mugshot hit social media before noon. Danny was stunned when he heard the news, sitting motionless in Robert's car after seeing the headlines. "She really tried to destroy everything again," he murmured. Robert said nothing at first, then turned to him. "Now do you see why you lost Ruth in the first place? She warned you once. You handed her heart to a woman who didn't deserve your attention." Danny exhaled deeply, staring out the window. That night, Ruth received a simple voice message from Betty. "It's done. She won't hurt your peace again." Ruth didn't reply. But the next morning, she stood outside in the garden longer than usual, her twins playing around her feet, the air lighter somehow, as though one final storm had passed. Following Kimberly's arrest, a delicate stillness settled over Ruth's life. Danny, careful and humbled, asked if he could start visiting the twins regularly. "Not at your house," Ruth clarified, "and not alone. Betty or I must always be present." Danny agreed without hesitation. "Any rules you set, I'll follow." Ruth chose Betty's garden as the meeting spot, a neutral place where her children could laugh without confusion and where Danny could begin to earn back trust one smile at a time. The twins, oblivious to the adult complexity around them, responded quickly to Danny's presence. Daniela would hand him her coloring book without being asked. Daniel, already more talkative, liked showing off his school projects. Ruth observed quietly from a distance, her heart torn between the fear of repeating history and the ache of watching her children find joy in their father's arms. One afternoon, Danny stayed a little longer than usual. Ruth came to remind him of the time, but paused when she saw Daniela sleeping in his arms. The moment looked so natural, so untouched by bitterness. "I should go," Danny whispered, rising carefully. Ruth nodded but didn't move. He glanced at her. "You still don't trust me, do you?" Her voice was soft but firm. "Trust isn't a door, it's a ladder. And you're still at the bottom." Danny smiled faintly, sadness in his eyes. "Then I'll climb, as slow as it takes." Ruth turned away, blinking quickly. Betty, who had overheard, watched with quiet approval. Later that evening, as Ruth laid Daniela down, the little girl mumbled, "Daddy's warm." Ruth kissed her forehead and tucked her in, whispering, "Yes, he is." That night, for the first time in a long while, she didn't dream in black and white. The sun was merciless that Saturday afternoon. Ruth, always active and refusing to be seen as fragile, led a charity walk to support single mothers in business. She smiled, waved, and gave a powerful speech, then continued walking despite the heat and fatigue creeping into her body. Betty noticed the slight tremble in Ruth's hand, the unnatural flush in her cheeks. "Ruth, maybe you should sit," she urged. "I'm fine," Ruth replied, forcing another smile. Moments later, her vision blurred, and her legs buckled beneath her. Gasps echoed, people ran. Ruth hit the pavement hard, unconscious before she could call for help. Betty screamed for an ambulance. The twins were with a minder, but Danny, who had come to support quietly from the crowd, pushed through in panic, his voice cracking. "Ruth, Ruth." At the hospital, the diagnosis was grim, stage 4 kidney failure. "She's been ignoring symptoms for months," the doctor told Betty and Danny. "She needs a transplant, fast." Betty covered her mouth in shock. Danny stood motionless, then said firmly, "Test me." "Now." The doctor hesitated. "Are you family?" "I'm the father of her kids, and the man who should have protected her better." He signed the papers. Ruth remained unconscious, tubes running from her arms, a slow beeping echoing in the room. Danny sat by her bedside, clutching her cold hand. "You can't leave, Ruth. Not like this. Not after everything." He pulled his chair closer, his voice breaking. "I can't undo the past, but please, let me save your future." Outside the glass, Betty wept softly, her hands trembling. This wasn't about redemption anymore. This was about life, hers, his, and the 2 little ones waiting at home. The hospital's transplant unit was quiet, sterile, and tense. As the medical team reviewed compatibility protocols, Danny sat across from the nephrologist, a vein of urgency running through every word. "You understand the risks?" the doctor asked, pen in hand. Danny nodded. "I understand more than you think. I'm not doing this to win her back. I'm doing this because I owe her life and not just mine." The team moved quickly, ordering a battery of tests. Danny was poked, scanned, and evaluated. Every hour felt like a century. Meanwhile, Betty stayed beside Ruth's hospital bed, watching the woman who had once been full of fire now sleep like a fragile petal. The twins were with Robert, asking questions she didn't know how to answer. 3 days later, the doctor approached Danny with the results. "You're a match," he said. "Not just good enough, you're ideal." Danny leaned back, his hand running over his face. "When do we do it?" The doctor hesitated. "We usually counsel donors for a week or 2. You should talk to your family." "I've already lost one," Danny cut in. "I'm not waiting to lose her too." Betty entered the room just in time to hear him. She said nothing, but her eyes softened. She had seen men beg, plead, pretend, but she hadn't seen many offer their body without strings. Later that evening, while watching Ruth sleep, Danny whispered, "You won't know I did it. I'm not even telling you unless you ask. But if you wake up, and I'm a little emptier, just know I gave you what was mine, because you were always mine to protect." Danny's admission as a donor wasn't publicized. Only Betty, the transplant surgeon, and a few silent nurses knew. Ruth, still unconscious, remained unaware that the man she once trusted with her heart was now entrusting her with an organ. As Danny was prepped for the operation, Robert came in quietly. "You don't have to do this to impress anyone," he said. Danny looked up, weary but sure. "Then it's perfect, because I'm not. I just want to be the man she needed when she was dying on the inside. Now that she's dying on the outside, I won't watch." Robert clapped him on the back. "That's the first honest thing I've heard you say in years." In another room, Betty watched over Ruth, holding her cold hand. "You've always been strong," she whispered. "But even strong people deserve to be carried sometimes." Outside the glass, the twins arrived briefly with Robert. Daniel asked, "Why can't we see Mommy?" Betty bent down. "Because Mommy's heart is very tired, but someone's helping her fix it." Daniela asked innocently, "Is it Daddy?" Betty looked toward the closed door, tears gathering. "Yes, he's trying." In the surgical prep room, Danny signed the final consent, then reached for a pen and paper. "If I don't wake up, give this to her," he told the nurse. Then he lay back, eyes closing slowly. This wasn't penance. It wasn't redemption. It was a choice, a quiet, sacrificial choice to love without requirement. And for the first time in years, Danny Daniels found peace in giving instead of taking. Kimberly hadn't visited a hospital in months, at least not as a patient or family. But the moment she learned Ruth was undergoing surgery, she showed up uninvited, red heels clicking against the white-tiled floor like defiance itself. Dressed in designer black with no smile to offer, she strode toward Ruth's room and convinced a young orderly to let her in. Betty was out for coffee. Danny was in surgery. It was her chance. "So this is what it took for the world to pity you," she murmured, standing over Ruth's unconscious form. "A hospital bed and a sob story. You always knew how to play the long game." Her voice was low, bitter. "Well done, Ruth. You win. I just hope he bleeds out proving himself to you." She turned to leave, but stopped short. Robert stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes like steel. "Touch her again, and I'll make sure the only headline you see next is your own fall from grace, this time with evidence." Kimberly scoffed. "Relax. I just wanted to say goodbye." Robert didn't move. "You already did when you lied, schemed, and almost ruined 2 children's futures. Now get out." Security was called, and Kimberly was escorted out of the hospital. As she stood on the curb waiting for her car, the sky opened with unexpected rain. She didn't have an umbrella, nor did anyone offer her one. That night, news broke of Danny's quiet kidney donation. Kimberly watched the headlines from her penthouse in silence, mascara running down her cheek. Ruth had won nothing through revenge. She had simply survived long enough for truth to clear the battlefield, and that was something Kimberly could never conquer. As the anesthesiologist counted backward for Danny, he gripped the corner of the hospital blanket with unsteady hands. Seconds before the sedation took full effect, he whispered, "I need to write something." They paused, gave him 10 minutes. His fingers trembled, but his thoughts were sharp. On a clean sheet of hospital stationery, he penned the letter in silence. "Ruth," he began, "if I never wake up, don't let bitterness carry this letter into the fire. Read it for the truth it holds, not the past we broke." He told her he had made many mistakes, some unforgivable, but loving her was never one of them. He poured out his heart in ink, not seeking sympathy but remembrance. "Tell Daniel and Daniela," he wrote, "that their father didn't just give them a name. He gave them what mattered most, his life. And tell their mother, she never stopped being mine, even when I stopped deserving her." He folded the paper slowly and sealed it inside an envelope, handing it to a nurse. "Only if I don't make it," he said. Then he was wheeled away. In Ruth's hospital room, Betty returned with coffee only to find a nurse slipping the envelope into Ruth's bedside drawer. "What's that?" she asked. "Something from the donor," the nurse said softly. Betty sat beside Ruth again, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. Her friend looked like a shell, but the soul inside, Betty knew, was still fighting. She took Ruth's hand. "If only you knew what that man is doing to keep you breathing." Ruth stirred faintly, her eyes fluttering. Betty leaned in. "Don't rush. But when you wake up, something's different now, not in the world, but in him." Elsewhere, Danny's operating room was filled with soft chatter and rhythmic beeping. The surgeon looked up. "We're ready." And as the first incision was made, so too was the beginning of something irreversible, not just in Danny's body, but in the tangled narrative that had once torn them apart. The surgery spanned hours. Ruth's transplant procedure began shortly after Danny's had ended. The kidney was healthy and already producing urine by the time they connected it inside Ruth's body. Outside, the waiting room remained tense. Betty paced while Robert sat with the twins. He had told them Mommy was sleeping, and Daddy had gone to help her wake up. Daniel had quietly said, like superheroes do. Robert only smiled. Something like that. When the surgery ended, Ruth was wheeled back to recovery, still unconscious. The lead surgeon walked into the waiting room and gave a soft nod. "It went well. She'll be in pain for a while, but the kidney's responding." Betty exhaled and sank into a chair. She didn't cry. She had done enough of that. But she whispered under her breath, "Thank you, God." 2 days later, Ruth stirred. The soft beeping of machines and the low hum of fluorescent lighting greeted her. Her throat was dry. Betty was at her bedside in an instant. "You're safe," she whispered, touching Ruth's hand. "They said the transplant took." Ruth's voice was hoarse. "Whose kidney?" Betty didn't answer. She just reached into the drawer and pulled out the envelope. Ruth stared at it for a long time before opening it. The moment her eyes scanned the first line, her lips quivered. As she read Danny's words, the tears came, not loud, not broken, but soft and steady. She clutched the letter to her chest and whispered, "Why didn't you just walk away?" Betty replied quietly, "Because this time, he finally learned how to stay." Outside the room, Danny lay in his own bed, pale and quiet, but alive. The nurse checked on him. He smiled faintly and asked, "Did she wake up?" When the nurse nodded, his eyes closed in relief. He didn't need to be called a hero. He just needed to know she'd be okay. Recovery was slow. Ruth remained in the hospital for several weeks, monitored closely. Her strength returned in fragments, an appetite here, a laugh there. One evening, just as the nurses finished their rounds, a knock echoed at her private room door. She assumed it was Betty, but instead a soft voice said, "It's just me and the kids." Ruth sat up slowly. The door opened, and Danny stood there, thinner, tired, but composed. He held Daniela in one arm while Daniel clung to his leg. Both children were in matching sky blue outfits. Ruth said nothing at first. The sight of them standing there, like a family that had paused and then resumed, made her chest tighten. "I asked the nurse if we could visit," Danny said. "She said 5 minutes. I'll count them." Ruth looked at the twins, whose eyes danced with joy. Daniela reached out. "Mommy, look. Daddy carried me up the stairs." Ruth managed a small smile. "Is that so?" Daniel walked over and laid his hand on the edge of the bed. "Daddy made us pancakes this morning. They were not bad." Danny laughed under his breath. Ruth's eyes lingered on the way he gently lifted Daniela onto the chair beside the bed, how carefully he helped Daniel sit. His movements were not for show. They were deliberate, quiet, sincere. When it was time to leave, Ruth whispered, "Thank you. For today." Danny turned back from the door, his voice calm. "Thank me for every tomorrow, if I earn it." And then he left, no pressure, no expectations. Just presence. Ruth returned home with a cane in one hand and Betty's arm in the other. The sunlight spilling through the sitting room window looked warmer than she remembered. But the walls, though familiar, still felt watchful. Her days became a rhythm of rest, hydration, and routine tests. Danny showed up daily, never with grand gestures, but always with the twins. He prepared their meals, did school drop-offs, and quietly coordinated with the housekeeper. He never entered her bedroom unless she called for something. Betty watched it all unfold and said one evening, "He's not rushing you, Ruth. He's repairing the roof without touching the walls." Ruth sighed, pressing a warm towel to her side. "I'm not afraid of him breaking me again," she murmured. "I'm afraid of believing he never will." The moment that shook her came unexpectedly. It was a Thursday afternoon. Rain tapped gently against the windows. Daniela fell and scraped her knee in the hallway. Ruth jumped up instinctively, then winced from the pain. Before she could move again, Danny was already there, lifting the crying child and calming her. "You're okay, my girl. Daddy's here," he whispered. He didn't glance at Ruth, but when Daniela clung to his neck and buried her face, Ruth saw it in his eyes. That look wasn't for her, it was for the life they created. Later that evening, Ruth sat beside Betty in silence. "He's not perfect," Ruth said slowly, "but there's something about the way he loves them now. It's not redemption. It's presence," Betty nodded. "Healing doesn't demand a deadline. Let him keep showing up. The walls don't fall in a storm, they soften in the rain." Danny no longer asked for conversations. He simply made himself useful. On mornings Ruth was too tired to sit. He read aloud in the living room so the twins wouldn't be loud near her door. When her medication caused nausea, he sat outside her bedroom just in case she needed a basin or water. At night, when Betty had gone home, he folded the laundry and left a note on her tray. "Rest is not a weakness. It's what brought you back." Ruth read those notes without replying, but each one felt like a thread stitching back the places inside her she had let unravel. One evening, Ruth caught him humming a lullaby in the kids' room. She leaned against the hallway wall, listening quietly as Daniel asked, "Daddy, are you sleeping in this house now?" Danny chuckled. "Only downstairs, champ. Mommy still holds the keys to all the rooms." Ruth blinked away tears. He wasn't forcing presence. He was earning permission. Later, as she sipped ginger tea in the living room, he brought her a fresh blanket and didn't linger. "You good?" he asked. She nodded, her voice low. "I didn't think you'd wait this long." Danny gave a tired smile. "When you finally returned, I realized how much I had lost. I'm not waiting for your heart. I'm here for the whole home. Even if I sleep on the steps." For the first time since the transplant, Ruth didn't respond. But when he left, she unfolded the blanket and wrapped it around herself, not just for warmth, but maybe for remembering. The rain had started late that night. Ruth sat outside under the sheltered bench in her compound, legs tucked beneath her and a shawl around her shoulders. The water fell gently on the concrete, dancing in thin rivulets across the pavement. She didn't know why she sat there, maybe to clear her mind, maybe to feel something that didn't ache. Danny stepped out, searching for a misplaced toy, when he spotted her. He hesitated, then walked quietly over. Without a word, he opened a large black umbrella and sat beside her, just enough space between them to breathe, but not enough to feel alone. "I thought you'd be asleep," he said after a while. Ruth didn't look at him. "The silence here. It's different now. Not heavy, just still." They sat quietly again. The raindrops softened into mist. Danny finally said, "You don't have to talk. I didn't come to ask questions. I just came to sit." Ruth looked at the edge of the umbrella where the drops slid off and touched the ground. "I used to sit here and imagine what you'd say if you ever came back. But nothing in those dreams ever felt this quiet." Danny's voice cracked slightly. "I'm not here to echo the old me. I came to become someone your silence can sit beside without flinching." A long pause passed. Then Ruth tilted her head slightly toward him and whispered, "Don't speak like that. It's easier to hate you when you don't sound like this." Danny lowered his eyes, then nodded. "Then I'll be quiet, until you're ready to hear me again." And with the rain as witness, they sat side by side under a single umbrella, both soaked in a kind of peace they didn't yet understand, but no longer feared. The following morning, the rain had dried, but something inside Ruth still lingered damp and vulnerable. She stood in the kitchen doorway watching Danny, who had come early to prep breakfast before the kids woke. They didn't see her. His focus was on slicing fruits and mixing oatmeal just the way Daniela liked, with a drop of honey and no raisins. Ruth watched as he tasted the spoon, nodded to himself, and set 2 tiny bowls down gently. It wasn't about perfection. It was the reverence in his actions. When he finally turned and saw her standing there in her cream robe, she didn't flinch. "You make it hard to stay angry," she said softly. Danny's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and caution. "That wasn't the goal," he said, wiping his hands. "Just wanted them to eat well." She stepped forward slowly, unsure if her legs would betray her. "But they do, and I see them becoming better. Because you're better now." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. Thank you, Danny. Not for the food, but for staying when you had every excuse to run again. For a second, his lips parted to speak, but she raised a hand gently. Don't say anything, not today. Let me sit in the quiet of this moment without promises or apologies. He nodded, understanding that sometimes words are too heavy when hearts are just beginning to rise again. As she turned toward the dining table, Ruth whispered, "This is the first morning I've felt full before eating." And he remained still in the kitchen, tears gathering but not falling, because it wasn't forgiveness yet. It was something even rarer, grace in motion. Weeks passed, and Ruth's strength gradually returned. The children resumed their laughter, and Danny's presence in their daily routine became less a surprise and more a foundation. It's one Sunday afternoon, as Ruth walked through the backyard with Betty. Watching the twins tumble across the grass, she whispered, "I think I've stopped bracing for heartbreak." Betty looked at her, the corners of her lips lifting. Then maybe it's time to build something again. That evening, as the house settled and silence crept in, Danny knocked once on Ruth's door. She opened, uncertain. He knelt, not with a ring, but with an old picture of them from happier days. "I never gave you the day you deserved. But if you say yes now, I promise not a day will pass without me remembering what I almost lost." Ruth stared at him, her breath caught between disbelief and recognition. He wasn't proposing out of guilt or urgency. His eyes told her he would wait again if needed. She took the picture from his hand and ran her thumb over their younger faces. "If I plan it," she said finally, "it won't be in some cathedral with chandeliers. It'll be under the tree the twins first learned to crawl, where we saw them become." Danny rose slowly, his voice trembling. "Anywhere, Ruth. Even if it's in a borrowed shirt and mismatched shoes. I just want to stand beside you again, without shadows." She nodded once, and in that fragile agreement, a new beginning whispered its first breath. A wedding not to impress but to reclaim. The garden was dressed in simplicity. No grand arches, no velvet aisle, just petals scattered by the twins, barefoot and beaming in matching white. Ruth wore a sleeveless dress that flowed like air, her natural coils pinned with baby's breath. Danny stood beneath the tree in a crisp white shirt and black slacks, his hands shaking slightly. Betty held the vows. Robert watched with quiet reverence. The guests were few, the silence sacred. Ruth walked slowly across the grass, not to be given away, but to arrive in full knowing. As she reached Danny, their eyes locked, not with longing, but with anchoring. When they exchanged vows, there was no poetry, no rehearsed rhyme, only honesty. "I don't come back to you as a healed woman," Ruth said softly. "I come whole because I walked through fire and lived. And today, I choose to love you without forgetting the ashes." Danny took a breath, barely able to hold it in. "I failed you once. I buried your voice with my pride. But now, every word I speak will be shaped to shelter your heart." Their fingers trembled as they held hands. When the officiator said, "You may seal it," it wasn't just a kiss, it was the closing of a wound and the crowning of a rebuilt love. And when Daniel whispered, "Mummy looks like an angel," Ruth laughed for the first time in years, not because she felt beautiful, but because she felt seen. The name change wasn't just paperwork. It was a quiet revolution within the walls of Ruth's heart. At the registry, with the twins sitting on either side of her in coordinated Ankara outfits, she watched as the clerk stamped the final document. "You're officially Daniel and Daniela Daniels," he said with a smile. Daniel, holding a mini Nigerian flag he'd refused to let go of all week, leaned toward his mother and whispered, "So now we're Daddy's team?" Ruth nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in her throat. Daniela clapped in delight, unaware of the deeper meanings her little name now carried. Danny stood behind them, unusually silent, watching the woman he'd once broken finally reclaim a future on her own terms and allow him a place in it. "We're one team now," he added gently, touching Daniel's shoulder. Ruth didn't resist the moment. For once, she didn't have to. Back at home that evening, Ruth brought out an old family album, placing a new photo, their wedding under the tree, on the first page. She didn't say much, but she watched as the children flipped through, curious and wide-eyed. Danny came beside her and offered his hand. "Can we start filling this together?" he asked, referring to both the album and the blank pages ahead. She didn't answer with words, just reached out and held his hand, firm and sure. The name they now shared wasn't a label. It was an inheritance built from dust, time, repentance, and the grace to begin again. That night, for the first time since her twins were born, Ruth slept without dreams haunted by the past. There was finally space for peace. While Ruth rebuilt, Kimberly unraveled in the shadows. The scandal surrounding her false paternity claims, defamation charges, and the humiliation at the hands of her own ambition had left her persona stained. She no longer appeared at society functions. Invitations stopped arriving. One by one, her allies distanced themselves, wary of aligning with a woman who mistook deception for power. Her once flashy apartment grew quiet, then vacant. A distant cousin confirmed to Betty in passing that Kimberly had relocated to a remote estate near Aloran. No calls, no visitors, he'd said. She doesn't even keep a phone anymore. Ruth listened in silence, no reaction on her face. Let her have her silence, she replied. That's all she ever gave others anyway. Danny never mentioned Kimberly again. Not out of hatred, but out of choice. They had chosen not to feed the ghost of a woman who'd once thought she won by breaking another. Even Robert, once silently curious about Kimberly's descent, no longer bothered to ask. Life had shifted. Focus returned to the twins, to healing, to making small memories count. Ruth often said, "The loudest victory is peace." Kimberly's silence, uncelebrated, undocumented, and unnoticed, was the final proof that Ruth never had to raise a weapon to win. She had simply walked forward, and time had done the rest. And in a world hungry for drama, Ruth's quiet triumph rang the loudest of all. The old house still stood at the end of the narrow street, wrapped in its own quiet and rust. Ruth hadn't returned since the day she left with nothing but her suitcase and dignity. Now, standing at its gate with Danny beside her and the twins between them, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for years. "This is where I became invisible," she murmured, her voice soft, eyes focused on the cracked steps. Daniel looked up at her, confused. "But we see you, Mummy." Daniela nodded, gripping her hand. Danny touched her back gently. "And now, so do I." Ruth stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate. She walked past the doorway where she once wept alone, pausing only to look up at the window where she had once waited for a love that never came. But now she had everything she never dared hope for. She turned around, her white scarf lifting in the afternoon breeze, and reached out for Danny's hand. Together they walked away, not in revenge, not in pride, but in radiant, healed silence. There were no goodbyes, only beginnings. The past had done its job. It had refined, not ruined. As they reached the car, Daniel asked, "Where are we going now?" Ruth smiled, bending down to his level. "Home," she said, "but not the kind you run from, the kind you grow in." The family of four drove off, windows down, the laughter of children spilling into the sky behind them. Ruth was no longer a woman trying to prove herself. She was at last twice blessed and forever whole. Here's the Bible verse for the story. Isaiah 61, verse 7. Why this verse? Because Ruth, though once discarded and mocked, was restored with not just love, but twice the blessing. She gained peace, her children, and a renewed marriage built on truth. The shame that once cloaked her life became the soil for her honor. Moral of the story: true healing doesn't scream revenge, it builds peace, one silent act of strength at a time. Letting go doesn't mean giving up, it often means trusting time, truth, and God to rebuild what betrayal tried to destroy. Ruth never needed to plot her redemption. She simply kept walking forward with dignity. And in doing so, she found not just justice, but joy, legacy, and wholeness. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.